Welcome, everyone, to Found in the Archives, Stories of Buried Treasure. I'm Jefferson Nowicki. I'm the archivist at the Maine Women Writers Collection at the University of New England's Portland campus. We're a small literary archive founded in 1959 of published and unpublished writing by and about Maine women. We collect authors and creators who identify as female, femme, trans feminine, and non-binary. And we're open to the public, and we would welcome a visit from any of you all to find your own buried treasure someday. So a few people to thank before we start our event. I'd like to thank Lee and David and Maureen and the rest of the communications team for all their behind the scenes work. I'd like to thank Megan Grammer for graphic expertise with our poster and flyer. And especially I'd like to thank all of the Maine Women Writers Collection team for working together to pull off this event. We begin by acknowledging that the Maine Women Writers Collection and the University of New England sit on the unceded ancestral home of the Wabanaki, whose tribes, the Micmac, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Penobscot, continue to caretake the land to this day. I encourage everyone in attendance tonight to support the nonprofit Wabanaki Reach, which highlights Wabanaki culture, language, and ways of being. I'm just going to right now drop a link to that excellent nonprofit in the chat. So as an archivist, I know I'm biased, but I believe that archives are strange, mysterious, and magical places. You never know what you're going to find, and you never know how you're going to find it. Maybe in your search for one thing, you instead find another thing even better than you originally hoped for. Maybe you find inspiration in a surprising place. Maybe simply spending time in a repository whose sole responsibility is to caretake information shines a light on a problem you didn't even know you could solve. Maybe it's something in the light. As an archivist, it's one of my favorite parts of the job is to talk to a researcher after they spent time in the collection and say, what did you find? How was your search? Because even though I know very well the contents of, say, box 4, folders 3 through 7, I never really know what's in there, and I don't know how they would connect out into the outside world. So often these stories of finding buried treasure in an archive are just that, buried. They're often subservient to the actual history that gets written into the chapter that gets published into the book. But tonight, we'd like to give our speakers and you as our audience a chance to hear the stories behind the scenes. We'll get the chance to peek behind the curtain and catch a glimpse of how the alchemical, magical act of history comes together. So, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to start with Dawn Potter. Dawn is the author of 9 books, most recently the poetry collection Accidental Hymn, which comes out next week. And I am going to drop a link to her beautiful book. It's a really beautiful cover into the chat. She directs poetry and teaching programs at the Frost Place, as well as the high school writing program at Monson Arts. Her poems and essays have appeared in the Swanee Review, the Three Penny Review, and the Beloit Poetry Journal, which is the literary journal where I saw an excerpt of the project that she's talking about tonight, which is a poetry manuscript from a diary at the Maine Women Writers Collection. And when I saw it, I thought it was so incredible, and I just knew we had to find some way to get her here to talk about that. So I'm really excited to hear about it. So, and she lives in Portland, and I will turn it over to you, Dawn.
Thank you, Jefferson, and thank you, everyone at UNE and at the Maine Women's Writers event. It's really exciting. One afternoon in the spring of 2018, I walked into the reading room of the Maine Women Writers Collection and asked the archivist, Kathleen Miller, if she could suggest something for me to read. I was, at the time, recovering from my first real bout with the loss of my 40-acre homestead in rural central Maine, where I'd lived for more than 2 decades. For all kinds of good reasons, my husband and I had sold the property and moved south to Portland, where I found myself barely able to manage my grief over my vanished land, my heart. And stony, a plot of looming pines and deep snows had been, as much as anything, a lesson in loneliness. It was an adversary, but also a muse. I had come to depend on it and did not know how to cope without it. We bought a little house in town. I was planting a new garden and my sap was running again. Still, the shadow of sorrow remained. I visited the archive because I wanted to find out how someone else had managed or not managed a sadness so hard to explain. This desolation that for months had felt like the amputation of my life. A disappointed woman. That was what I wanted to explore. In the archives, Kathleen listened to my awkward request. Then, after looking at me for a moment, she disappeared behind a door and returned carrying a cardboard box. Here, she said, try these. What she brought me were the diaries of Isabella Maria Hofstis, a 19th century resident of Waldoboro, Maine. Though her notebooks span the years 1862 to 1908, an era of great national turmoil, they make little mention of exterior events. Rather, they are an intense record of her melancholy, her spiritual struggles, her isolation. Isabella Hofstis was not famous for anything. She was not unusually creative or empathetic. She did not enjoy her job as a school teacher. She was annoyed by her relatives. Her main interest was her own unhappiness. She was obsessed by it. Page after page, notebook after notebook, for decades, she poured out her agony and her despair. I've used historical materials in many creative projects, but to this point, with the exception of family papers, they'd always been printed or digitized. And family papers carry their own what should I reveal or not reveal weight. So the biggest surprise for me was my sense of freedom in physically touching these original materials. The alluring challenge of interacting with mysterious handwriting and aging paper, combined with a complete lack of responsibility for anyone else's feelings or presumptions, which is a major hogtie of family papers. I realized that I didn't have to transcribe or address the archival material in any factual way, that I could sit with it, let it exist inside me, be patient, be reckless, allow something surprising to emerge. And as it turned out, the diaries of Isabella Hofstis were an explosive trigger. I began by copying passages from them into my notebooks, but she'd primarily written in pencil, and many of her entries were so faded that I could barely read them. So gradually, I began allowing myself to treat them sort of like Mad Libs. If I couldn't work out what she was saying, I'd just put something else in. And in this way, I found myself borrowing the writer's syntax and disconnected phrases to construct a character and a voice, a narrative and a landscape. Without plan or forethought, I wrote a complete poetry manuscript from beginning to end in the space of a month. My poems do not in any way tell Isabella's actual life story, but they are deeply indebted to her words, her syntax, her self-questioning. At times, they quote directly from her entries, though almost always in fragments, erasures, and meldings. But Isabella was a wordy writer, page upon page of complaint and anguish. So it's strange to me that my own poetic response to her voluminous misery was to explode into a series of terse, compressed lyrics. I became obsessed with repression, for that too is a diary keeper's element. What doesn't get said becomes a black hole. The words circle, circle, and then there is nothing. The manuscript I wrote is titled A Month in Summer. It's set in Midcoast, Maine in 1868, and it's organized into 4 sections, each one encompassing a week. Each of those weeks is broken into days, and each day includes a brief prose diary entry followed by a small poem. The prose entries tend to focus on the exterior world, whereas the poems tend to describe the interior. One thing that interested me greatly was the recognition that emotional distress in these days before Freud was often pinned to spiritual struggle. In her diaries, Isabella is constantly castigating herself for not loving God enough. She is perpetually blaming her misery on her religious inadequacy. And so I found myself drawn in making these poems and creating my unnamed character to that link between spirit and sadness. I'm going to read weeks 1 and 2 from A Month in Summer. Though you won't be able to hear this, I've maintained the erratic capitalization and spelling styles that tend to show up in 19th century American handwriting. So I'm going to quickly screen share the excerpt that's been published in the Beloit Poetry Journal, so you'll be able to see those visual patterns, which are intended to reinforce time and setting. So you can see the diary entries contain the abbreviations, the missing capitalizations, whereas the poems tended not to, partly because I really wanted there to be a sense of difference between exterior and interior. The first week, Monday. School today, scholars wild as hares, brother Dave plow, so, etc. Sold my heifer. Bad teacher. My school is my skin this forenoon. God is an inefficient spirit, and I have been injudicious. I have spoken words visibly with my life. Tuesday. Coughing all night on account of the kitchen fire. Stove wood enough to last a month, though not more. Dave as usual, which is not pleasant. Dusting the parlor. I have nothing to say about anything, yet I am my own mistress to myself. Wednesday. Quilt to quilt, make pickles. Dave to Rockland with early potatoes. School done for good, I shall not say more. Evening chores. So this day is cleansed of sunshine and our passions. I seem past feeling. I am calloused by results. The cows stand on the crest of the bitten hill. It is not pleasant to lie in a dirty place. Thursday. Wash, sew. Bessie calved, a fine bull. Copy the psalm. Shall not speak of Dave. Hanging laundry. Keep on the line of reason. I think too little. I have no ideas. Truth is the mind's chime. I mark the willfulness of the sea. I have no claim on God. Friday. Commence a shirt for brother. He grows fatter than before. No visitors. Ironing shirts. Mind bound, I welcome a fair wind. May I meet everything that is strange with calmness. May my heart be awkward, awakened. The little children are playing on the common. I am not a shrewd woman. I must do right all the time. Saturday. Dave to Rockland with butter, then home with shocking news. Churn, etc. Shelling peas. There is a little sorrow in my mind this evening. Thus I shall make a list of things. I must keep dark. The wind shifts slowly to the north. Discouragement is a wonder like sickness. Sunday, church alone. Black walk. My room is damp. My intellect is dull as a hoe. In this terrain of night thoughts, I come unstrung. Yet when I start for the sea, I know where I'm going. The second week. Monday, bake for brother 3 meat pies, 5 loaves. I travel to Rockland tomorrow, spend 2 days with cousin V. Of course, Dave grudges my absence, etc. Kneading. Rags of sunlight cheer my heart. I am going to try to write a little. I have nothing at stake but my life. Tuesday. Roads as poor as ever. Will nothing change? Cousin V in good health, except a lowering sensation in her head. This evening, Uncle escorts us to view a Shakespeare play. My first. Oh dear, we will see some high life now. Reading the newspaper. I am ignorant of so many things. I am ashamed to ask questions of strangers. I am what I would not be. Why should I costume myself? Wednesday. Bought a hat, $2.10, and pay 65 cents for copybooks and lead pencils. They say the bay is as fine as Naples, but the lime kilns burn night and day, belching fire, rolling smoke. As you like it. I have attended the theater just to see what it is. Imperviousness could not dream there often. Thursday, rain, home once more. Brother rinsed his dishes, I should be grateful. The news from cousin V has startled me more than I care to admit. Dave shows no concern, however. Mending. I took a cup of tea and ate a bite of bread and butter. I vainly tried to read a psalm. I felt that I hated. The dust caught in my throat. Friday. Rainy, cut and sew another shirt for brother. Old Sarah lost her colt, which is $30 gone. Still, I am in 2 minds about taking another school term, though in truth, they are not likely to ask me. Scrubbing floors. We belong to the scrambling class, business and loathing in our nostrils. But I will not crouch like a cowed dog. I have seen a vision of a white field. Saturday. Fox took 2 turkey poults. Sunshine at last, wash all day. My mind on other things. Boiling sheets. What am I? What sort of place do I inhabit? This will be a long and malevolent day. Sunday. Church alone. Dave puts his soul in peril, but I shall not. New Testament. Mary was a plain, quiet woman. I glimpse the half shape of my future. So that's weeks 1 and 2. And while I won't say dramatic things happen, things do move along a little bit with some hints about what could be happening mysteriously in Rockland. So I'm happy to answer questions afterwards and talk a bit more about whatever, but I'm really grateful, so grateful that my interaction with Kathleen at the archives allowed me to move into this place that I had no expectation existed. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And I'm so grateful.
Thank you, Dawn. Wow, that has such rhythm moving between the two sections, and as you said, like, quite a bit of drama in that. And I was Dave and his soul in peril, and all day, all things Dave gets up to, and yeah, that was really fun. And I just took a note on the phrase of moving from voluminous mystery to being obsessed with repression, like how you started really, her voluminousness, and you kind of condense it. Yeah, it was really fun. Okay, so as Dawn mentioned, we will have a little chance at the end to have a brief question and answer session. So our next speaker is Elizabeth DeWolfe. She's professor of history and co-founder of the Women's and Gender Studies program at UNE, where she teaches courses in women's history, American culture, and historical research methods. Dr. DeWolfe is the author of several award-winning works of history, including The Murder of Mary Bean and Other Stories, which I'm going to drop a link to that into the chat now. That book is about the short life and sad death of a 19th century textile mill operative. Her current project explores a Maine stenographer turned detective working behind the scenes of a trial of the century. And I have heard a couple of those stories behind that particular manuscript, and they are actually, it's an incredible story. It's the kind of stories that opens into another. So I'm excited to hear when that book comes out. So, okay, I'll turn it over to you, Beth.
Hey, thank you very much, Jefferson. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do that and that, share, and that. There we go. How's that? Good, good. All right. Oh, thank you everyone for coming tonight to hear some of these archival stories. So I'm going to talk a little bit about luck in the archive. So the project that I'm working on now started as an investigation into a congressman's mistress. And along the way, I discovered a spy. So this is Madeline Pollard. She is the longtime mistress of Kentucky Congressman William C.P. Breckenridge. Breckenridge had promised for years and years that he would marry her, but he dragged his feet on setting a wedding date. So Pollard took matters into her own hands and announced the engagement in the Washington Post, which came as quite a surprise to Breckenridge's grown children, to Breckenridge himself, and to his new secret wife, Louise Wing. As you can imagine, Pollard was humiliated with these revelations. And so she again took matters into her own hands and sued him for breach of promise, for his failure to marry her. And this was in August of 1893, and this was going to become, in the following year, a trial of the century. So historians had written very little about Madeline Pollard other than her 15 minutes of fame as Breckenridge's mistress. So off I went to the Library of Congress to read through the Breckenridge family papers. And Congressman Breckenridge was himself a rather famous politician, and he was from a very long-standing and highly regarded political family from Kentucky. So their family papers indeed survive, and they are here in the Madison Building, one of several buildings that comprise the Library of Congress. 263 linear feet, 871 containers of material. And so I followed the story through the Breckenridge papers. Of course, it's being told through Breckenridge's eyes. And what I found was that by January 1894, the breach of promise trial was fast approaching, and Breckenridge was in trouble. His legal team had made a number of missteps, and frankly, he didn't have a leg to stand on. He was getting desperate, and he was up for re-election. So the letters in early January 1894 start to hint at some sort of secret plan. Breckenridge's attorney and close friend, a man named Charles Stoll, planned to travel to Boston to meet with an unnamed woman. Stoll told Breckenridge, "I'm thoroughly convinced that an unprofessional is best in this case and will make an effort to secure some satisfactory person." An unprofessional what? So I followed along, reading the letters of late January and early February. Stoll indeed secured the services of a young woman, a Miss Parker, no first name, who had been hired to seek out and obtain information from Madeline Pollard. Now, when I first read of Miss Parker, the name rang a bell. This case generated thousands of newspaper articles and a handful of books, including this one, which purported to be a detective tale, a diary of 10 weeks' intimate association with the real Madeline Pollard by Agnes Parker. The tale, as I read it, was cloak and dagger and at times really overwrought. But could this tale be true or true-ish? Was Miss Parker, who appeared in Breckenridge's letters, the same as Agnes Parker, the author of this book? Well, Agnes Parker, the author, described an incredible experience, that she had been sequestered in an Episcopal home for fallen women. She worked to befriend Madeline Pollard, and in their fake heart-to-heart talks, pull information from her that would be helpful to Breckenridge. Now, in the book, Agnes Parker claimed that she coded her notes in stenography and sent them to a woman named Julia in Boston, who then transcribed the notes and sent them to a Mr. X back in Washington. But a search of the census and of demographic records in Washington, D.C. came up empty for anyone named Agnes Parker. Who was this author and maybe spy? Now, in Breckenridge's papers, a rich grouping from February 1894 provided some clues. Just as in the real Madeline Pollard, in the letters, we see that Miss Parker sent notes from Washington in stenography to a Henrietta Bailey of Boston, who then transcribed the notes and passed those notes on to Mr. Stoll, sending them back to Washington, D.C. Now, in one letter, Miss Parker finally signed her full name, Agnes Parker. Now, recall that Charles Stoll had met a mystery woman in Boston. Bailey lived in Boston. Parker must be from Boston. So I searched for Agnes Parker in Boston records. Nothing. So I continued to read through the Breckenridge letters. Details in the letters mirrored events described in the book, The Real Madeline Pollard. So I worked back and forth between Breckenridge's letters and Parker's book, seeking clues to Parker's identity. So much like Parker, who was shadowing Pollard, I played a detective role in trying to suss out Parker's reality. The letters revealed additional aliases. Miss Johnson, for example, or letters that were signed simply A. Meetings were held at night. Parker was to come veiled. There were code words to enter buildings. It was clear to me that Agnes Parker, whoever she was indeed a spy, an undercover detective, and no scholar had ever written a word about her. Yet, who was she? So on my next trip to the Library of Congress, I continued making my way through the Breckenridge papers. The trial ended in April, Breckenridge lost, and Miss Parker disappeared from his correspondence, which became filled with invoices and demands for payment from lawyers, judges, typewriters, and others involved in the case. One letter was from Breckenridge's own daughter, Sophonisba, with whom Agnes Parker had actually become quite close. Sophonisba was asking her father to make good on his promises and pay, as she wrote, pay Miss Johnson for all her good work. Sophonisba then named in full Miss Johnson, Jane Johnson. Another letter in this file began apologetically requesting payment for work performed. The work was unspecified, but the author mentioned receiving partial payments from Mr. Stoll and Mr. Worthington, names I knew from earlier letters. Between the men and Miss Parker, the author told Breckenridge, I have my mail sent me in any one of 3 names, but I think it would be as well to send it in my own name, Jane Tucker, as it might be easier to cash a check in that name. Agnes Parker is Jane Johnson, is Jane Tucker. Now I have a name and a rough age, knowing that Stoll sought a female spy the same age as Pollard. A search of Ancestry.com for Jane Tuckers, born around 1863 in the United States, yielded 75,990 hits on 3,800 pages. That's a lot of ancestry. Then it occurred to me, since Agnes Parker was an alias, then the copyright record of her book might reveal not only Tucker's name, but Tucker's address. And luckily, the copyright room is just a couple floors above the manuscript reading room in the Library of Congress. And so I went and took a look. Dead end. The record is in Agnes Parker's name. But the next day, in the Library of Congress, the research gods smiled on me. I found Jane Tucker's bill for her detective work that she sent to Breckenridge in a folder of miscellaneous financial records, separated from her request for payment letter. The bill laid out her monthly expenses, a typewriter, Harper's Magazine, bourbon, all items that make an appearance in the book, The Real Madeline Pollard. It included the monies received from Stoll and Worthington. It was definitive proof that Jane Tucker was Agnes Parker, that she had actually been a spy. The bill documented the reality of the Truish published account. When I found it, it was all I could do to stay in my seat. I photocopied the bill. I photographed it. I tucked the image away on my hard drive. I emailed my husband from the reading room. I don't remember my exact words, but the substance was gold. I've found gold. Now, later that evening, as is my research habit, I reviewed the day's finds, sitting on a big hotel bed with papers and notes spread all around me. And I pulled out the photocopy of the bill to read it more carefully. And it's actually 3 pages. The clue I had been looking for to figure out who was Agnes Parker, who was Jane Tucker, leapt out at me. In the excitement of discovery in the reading room, I'd only skimmed the document, knowing right away I had found gold. But I missed the first line of her invoice, where she records her traveling expenses to Washington. from Maine, where I just happened to live. I nearly fell off the bed. Now I had a name, a birth year, and a place. And so I returned to Ancestry. Adding Maine to the search criteria narrowed down the Jane Tuckers born in 1863 to about a dozen or so. I eliminated the too old and the too young, the married and the widowed. And then with some cyber research, I turned up a home in coastal Maine, Castle Tucker, a property of Historic New England, an organization dedicated to the preservation of architectural gems in the region. Now, a search of Historic New England website revealed that they held a collection of Tucker family papers, including correspondence from one Jane Tucker. The headquarters is in Boston, so I made an appointment and took the Downeaster. And when I arrived, it was clear that my query had raised some eyebrows. I was ushered into a very crowded reading room with archival boxes stacked on every surface. And I sat at a long wooden table. And opposite me was the director, the curator, and an archivist. And so I laid out the steps of my discovery, how Jane Tucker had been a Gilded Age spy. No, they shook their collective heads. You've got the wrong Jane Tucker. She worked at a department store. She worked as a stenographer, but she ran her own beauty products business, and then she cared for the family home. Sorry, common name, wrong Jane Tucker. I sat there thinking how dismal the 2-hour train ride was going to be to go back home, and I was going to stew about where did I go wrong when one of the staff asked, "Where did you say this Tucker was working?" I said, "Washington, D.C." And I watched the archivist's eyes go wide. She had processed the collection and remembered letters from Washington. So one of the staff retrieved a box from 1894, and there they were. A letter from Jane's mother telling Jane's sister how Mr. Stoll, for whom Jane, I later learned, had worked in New York City a year prior, had offered Jane a very special job. There was a letter describing a rush trip to Boston to meet an unnamed man. A letter from Jane to her mother cautioning her not to tell anyone she was in Washington, D.C. A catalog from a Boston stenography school Jane had attended, and on the back cover of that catalog, an endorsement from a recent graduate, Henrietta Bailey. I had found a spy, Jane Armstrong Tucker, an undercover detective, one who was so good at her task that her secret identity was hidden until the 21st century. So was this my lucky break? Sure, in some ways, it's lucky these papers survived, and it's lucky I was the first to stumble on the story. And that bill, especially, was the key to this entire puzzle. Indeed, I was there, the bill was there, it was kismet. It's luck that I sat down one day at the only empty seat at the hotel breakfast room and chatted with a grad student, also doing research at the Library of Congress. We exchanged quick research descriptions, ate, and went our separate ways. A couple hours later, I looked up and she was standing at my research table asking, "Was I the woman she had breakfast with?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, Did you say you were working on a project about a man named Breckenridge?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I have something I think you're going to want to see." And she did indeed, working on a Washington, D.C. author who recorded in her own letters rather snarky and priceless comments on Breckenridge's fall from grace. It was luck that I once flicked the last page of a book stuck onto the cover. The page in this 19th century work fell open, and behind it was a totally unknown broadside for an anti-Shaker lecture given by the very woman, an anti-Shaker activist, that I was researching. Perhaps the research goddess smiles on me because she knows for every lucky find, there are hundreds of hours of finding nothing. Luck is a masquerade for persistence and skill, for instinct to check all the way to that last page, to have your elevator pitch at hand, to talk to anyone who wants to listen about your project, to know a good project when you stumble on it, and to check every one of those 800 boxes, because letters, like Tucker's, get separated from bills, and it's up to historian to reunite these puzzle pieces. Luck is arriving in Washington, D.C. on the very peak day of the Cherry Blossom Festival. As for archival research, as I tell my students, sure, there's luck, but when opportunity knocks, you have to know how to open a door. Thank you. And I will unshare.
Thank you, Beth. Wow. What a story. What a story. I mean, you said, I love the quote, luck is a masquerade for persistence. But boy, that story that you mean, I felt like I was watching a movie happen. It was like it had so much suspense there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. We're going to go to our final speaker of the evening. It's Carol Dana. Carol Dana was appointed the language master of the Cultural and Historic Preservation Department of the Penobscot Nation in 2002. This came after decades of her study and preservation efforts of the Penobscot language, which began in 1982 when she served as a research assistant to Dr. Frank T. Siebert, who created a written system and published a dictionary of the Penobscot language, which at this point had been almost entirely destroyed by the impact of government-run residential schools. Ms. Dana's work on the Penobscot Dictionary was the start of a decades-long mission to preserve and share the Penobscot language as a living language. Ms. Dana also collected and edited stories of Gluskabe, the legendary trickster, and published them as Still They Remember Me, Penobscot Transformer Tales Volume 1, in Penobscot and English with art from the tribal community. And if you're not familiar with that book is very special. It's beautiful, really well produced, very engaging. I'm going to just put a link to that into the chat. It's really worth it. Okay, Ms. Dana and her extraordinary work were recently featured in a 2021 article in the New Yorker about the colonization of languages. Okay, Carol, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, well, I'm glad I found my stories on the couch. I'll read some of them to you. I started writing poetry in the 60s, and in the, was it 70s? Oh, I got encouraged to write by my English teacher, Emaine Machias. In 70 to 80, I had poems, and I went to college, 85. I think I wrote some there too. What I started doing, because somebody had encouraged me to write short stories. You know, they read my poetry and they liked it, and they said, you should be writing short stories. So I went and I was writing, and they're just one pagers, but they're about my grandparents, because my children will never know them, you know, and now I write for my great grandchildren, and now I feel like I write for everybody. There's two versions of my grandfather's tent. Then I'll read Daddy's Geese, and I can read it in Penobscot also, and a couple others I may have in this folder here. My grandfather's tent. My whole family used to camp when I was a young girl. We camped upriver on lakes and near the ocean. I remember my dad telling my cousin to cut a Y-shaped stick, maybe 5 feet tall. There would be two longer for the main ridge pole and two short ones on the sides. Then the poles have names in the language. I only knew the name of one, but the poles were stuck in the ground. I'm losing my place. Anyway, we had a canvas tent that went over there. Ridge poles were placed on them and tied in place. And it was my grandfather's tent that he used. He used to cut stumpage on the next island, Orson Island. Then this canvas tent was thrown over it. The sides were tied. We laid down cedar first to deter bugs, and then for a balsam, and that was our bedding, with sleeping blankets or sleeping bags on top of that. The tent was what my grandfather lived in when he trapped in the Sun Cays area and when he cut stumpage on Orson Island. Him and my grandmother used to go and stay there. They only took his gun, potatoes, onions, and a knife. Grampy also liked to pick cranberries and lay them out in the yard in the sun, so the tent had served him well. My mother said he used to spread them on canvas and dry him in the sun and he'd bring them in a wooden crate, and then he'd put them out again, till he had dried them out. We slept in Aurora one time. My aunt was there and her daughter. And as, children and mom and dad, my aunt woke up and felt something heavy, breathing hard, lying against her on the outside of the tent. She could hear and feel it. Iggy, she said, it's my dad's nickname. She whispered to my father, I know, he said. Where's your gun? In the car, he said. She said, I was up at the crack of dawn cooking bacon and eggs for everyone, and that's the last darn time I ever went camping. So it was in Aurora on the road, and I guess there was an old dump, and they could see the grass kind of tamped down. So it had to be there, laying right there, almost next to her. Grampy used the canvas tent in the winter also. My cousin said he had gone with him one year to check his traps. Then there I had on 2 coats, he said. I was shivering. He had covers also when they slept. Grampy had a wall the other side of the fire to reflect heat back into the tent. Butch said he woke up cold. He looked out of the tent and there was Grampy in the early morning, just his long johns on, building the fire back up. So I love these little stories. I got them mostly from my aunt's kids. This is another version of Grampy's tent. We used to camp near the ocean in Grampy's tent. We lived in that old canvas tent. We needed 4 poles to put it together. 2 longer poles with the ridge poles. Skahagen is our name for it. We needed 4 smaller poles for the sides. Once the poles were in the ground, we threw the canvas tent over and tied the sides together. We placed cedar and fir balsam boughs inside the tent for our bed, which was the floor of the tent. We cooked in a big pot and sometimes used seaweed. We had corn and potatoes and sometimes lobster. Mom loved to eat clams. It was fun. My parents told me that food tasted better outdoors. These are my favorite times. We were together as a family, cooperating, and there was no fighting. My sister and I have memories around the smell of fir balsam. Mom put the boughs around the door of our house at Christmas. Mom and Dad banked the house with troughs of dirt and put the boughs on top of there. And I think this goes back to airspace around the wigwam as an insulator. I always wondered why they did that. And because the boughs left some space there and then the snow would come over there. And so there's empty space, which is a good insulator. Mom used to put fir balsam on top of this wood stove for the air in the house. Cleans the bacteria and germs out. We camped many other places in Grampy's tent. My favorite place was by the sea. We camped upriver and besides lakes and ponds, some of them being Black Island in the river, Deer Lake and Mud Pond and Molasses Pond. Oh, my aunt told me a story, and that's the same story again. I retold it again, how she called to my dad, where's your gun? He says, in the car. There wasn't much she could do. This is a story I found in Frank's notebook that nobody seems to know about. I'm just going to tell it because I really love it. There were these shamans that wanted to test one another's powers. They all went inside a wigwam. One by one, they challenged one another, and one by one, they left the wigwam. The last one out was a dragonfly. He was the most powerful. All that time, he was there on a rope hanging from the smoke hole in his nymph form. He went unchallenged. he had the power to transform himself. So that's why he's the most powerful shaman. This is about my cousin Neil. When Neil was in the 5th grade, he went to the Old Town Library and read about the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades. He was going to school on the island, taught by the nuns. The next day in school, he asked the teachers, who was a nun, Sisters of Mercy, about it. He said, "You teach us about love. Why are you teaching us not to kill? And the church has killed all these people." She took him in the, I said closet, but in the other room. They used to do paddlings there and wrapped his knuckles with the pointer. He grabbed it from her and beat her fingers. Well, I think he hit her too. And he tells us he went down to the ferry, and my grandfather was a ferryman, and asked him why he wasn't in school. He said, "I'm going to see if I can go to the Herbert Gray School there in Old Town." He said, "Yes." Mr. Bushard, he went and talked to him, and he asked him, "Can I come to school here?" And Mr. Bushard said, "Yes, you can start tomorrow morning." When he got home, Mother was standing in the doorway and wanted to know what happened. He told her, and he thought he was going to get it. She said, "Okay," and went in the house. He thought he was going to be punished, and she just went back in the house and said, "Okay." He was a precocious child. This is when he told me. Daddy's Geese, as told to me by Neil Phillips. One year there was a wet snow. All the geese landed in Mama and Daddy's backyard. Grampy was out the back window with his shotgun trying to shoot them. Every time he shot, they flew up, but they came right back down. Then he'd shoot again. Clifford came down from the Mitchell house to ask, "What's going on?" "Get out of here," Daddy said. "You'll scare my geese away." Mama was hollering, "You'll get in trouble with the game warden, Sil." I told this story to Jerry Francis, and he said, "Oh, sure, anything good eaten within a mile of Indian Island was to be had." So Connor translated this for me, and it's Eo Besquida, Wadagani son, Bejit Dewi Ladawag, Eo get Wapdagwag, Wadawag, Nolhemisege, Nitya Nemusamsa, Wanudabin, Aquajita Lawat, Ajita Agwajita Lawat, Ni Wadawabi Tawila, yeah. Wadawabi Tawilaldina, Nit Asque Mina, Wa Tamega, Tawilausuldina, Nit Mina, Wadagwajita Lawan, Ni Nisalage, Aquajigaset, Dunmina Alita Bila. What's happening? Kind of like Majal Gittia, Ida Musumsa, Gadi Alamip Walaga, Nawaptagwamak, Ni Widali Gagalwam, Nigawus, Gadi Tiga Nego Gokajak Silpesta, Eo Eli Kizado Gawa, Solom Caesar, Blunsuez, Nita, D Lagon, Chukahaga Adakwet, Mizigak, Willie, Gizimi Jasik, Waji, Nagwadol Dewagwake, Benawupske, Nidech, Mijazo. I have a hard time because I haven't been reading that much. Connor translated that for me anyway. And if you don't do it all the time, you get kind of rusty. So this was a collection of stories. We had met Margaret Newton at a conference, Margot and I did. And she said, "What about little people?" She said, "Why don't you write about little people?" But there again, people don't feel like they're supposed to talk about it. So we got very short stories, but it's, my Uncle Bill told me about the time a little person appeared at the old tribal hall down street. The council was meeting and they were drinking. A little person came to the door and said, "You keep it up and this place will be covered with sumacs. In other words, it will be empty." He was right. There's no council hall there now. They're up here in the ball field. So that was a story he told us from when he was a boy. He lived right across from the old council hall. Cynthia told me she was looking out her window when she saw a little person walking around. It was about 4 feet tall, she said, and she was thinking that maybe she shouldn't be looking at him. I told her my grandfather thought it was good luck to have seen one. My friend Hopsus told me she saw a little person. She had moved from Indian Island and lived up Alder Stream with her friend and partner, Georgia. She had seen a little brown figure in the brown leaves across the stream. That's all she told me. My mother knew of a man who had gotten lost in the woods. He was going along and all of a sudden nothing looked familiar to him. Then there was this little person there. He showed him the way out. I could hardly believe it. He was a man of the woods. Don't ever tell anybody, she said. Now they are both gone. So I thought it was safe to tell the story. My Aunt Clara told me our family will always have good luck because Grampy, Joe Dennis, saw a little person. Don't ever forget that, Duz, she told me. Duz is a name for my daughter. You know, it's a term of endearment too, but she told me that. One day she was visiting my dad. So I heard of the little people coming in the night and braiding the horses' tails back when our people used horses to do their work. It happened at Kingsclear too. Black Island is an island, 2 islands up from here at Indian Island. 2 up from Indian Island, there's Black Island. There were these men camping there who had been drinking. When they went into the tent to go to bed, they heard little noises like someone throwing pebbles on the tent. It did not stop, so some of them went to the shore and slept under the canoes like they often did. And the sound of little objects hitting there went on and on. So they got up and left and went home. Oh, this is one I want to write. Well, I wrote it very shortly, and Connor translated this, and I don't know where the other page is, but hoping he'll do it again for me. It's about my mother. It's a mixture of what she told me and what I heard. A girl named Rita. There was a little girl named Rita. She had heard stories of the little people. She wanted to know them. When she was in the woods, she looked for them. She looked under trees. She looked under rocks. She was looking for their houses, their homes. They were called Mikamwasu. She used to go on the trap line with her father. That's when she'd look around the woods for them, the little people's houses. They were in sun caves. Near the shore and under rocks and by the trees, she looked and looked. You will probably never see them, her father told her. They don't want to be seen. If you do, they will ask you not to tell and will give you one wish. This is about my grandfather again. I think it's the same thing. Well, I was pretty proud of him, what I heard about him. My grandfather, Sylvester Francis, used to hunt and trap in the Sun Cays area. He also took all kinds of jobs to put food on the table. I'm sure he's hunted and trapped and put food on the table also. Back in the day, we lived in direct relation with the earth. Well, he was known to take a deer now and then in hard times, as did a lot of people. He was going into his camp when the game wardens came rushing in. We know you have a deer in here, they said. We want to have a look around. Take a look, my grandfather told them. So they did. Well, I don't see anything here, they said, so they left. All that time, my grandfather was standing on a little rise in the snow. It was his deer covered with snow. A lot of people had to poach to stay alive. At the turn of the 19th century is when our people came off the islands in the river due to the restrictions placed upon them by the state. This was assimilation and the beginning of the loss of our language, because they came here and they were told, well, I'll finish the story. Raymond Paul told me in the 80s, you and Barry are trying to turn around a trend that started 60 years ago when the big wigs of the tribe went door to door and told the people, never mind making baskets. We need to work in town. Never mind your language. We need to learn to speak English now. So that was the assimilation. I think that's all I have. Well, I have one more. This is pretty interesting. I'll just read this one. Seance. And my grandfather wasn't very religious. You know, he was himself. Dad told me the story about him and Grampy went to a seance. They went to see a woman some people call black magic. First, let me tell you about Grampy. He never appears to be too much into Catholicism or too religious. He used to make fun of the people who went to the stream below the tunnel where it poured into the Penobscot. The people went there on Good Friday to wash their face, believing it was like holy water because the priest had blessed it on Corpus Christi when the procession went to the graveyards. My grandfather would laugh and say, that's nothing but swamp runoff, which it was. My dad told me the story about he and Grampy had gone to see black magic. Her husband, Sabatis, had just died. Well, they went in the house not knowing what to expect when the candle went out and they heard knocking on the floor. A door opened and closed and they heard footsteps coming down the hallway. All of a sudden, a table started walking towards them. It's only Sabatis come to see you, she said. They turned around and beat feet and went right to the priest's house and told him what happened. Well, what did he say? I asked. Oh, he said, don't hang around with people like that, which is ironic because we all live together. People like that is us. Oh, dear. So I think that's it for the stories. I just wrote about, that's just a repetition of what I had before. But I plan to write now. I'm finally retired and I've got time off, so there'll be more. I just bought 3 notebooks and 2 packs of pens, so I'm getting ready.
Great, Carol. Thank you. Thank you so much for telling those stories. The story about the little people were fascinating and haunting too.
Yeah.
Okay, so I bet that we would have some questions from the audience. So I thought we could do this was you could we would just have a kind of a brief question and answer. If you want to put their question into the chat, you could do that. Or if you feel comfortable unmuting and just saying it, I think I'm fine with that.
Oh, can I say something to everyone?
Yes.
This book, Pagans in Our Midst, was written, I think, in 1972 by Andre Lopez. And what he done, he proved that whenever Indigenous people, Native people try to assert their rights, there was a lot of racism. And the researcher, Andre, went back in the archives and found that to be true. And I think Maine has a lot of material if anybody would want to do something like that for here.
Yeah, that sounds like an important project. Great. Okay, I see a hand. Thank you, Carol. Monica, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you. This was an unbelievably entertaining and informative program. I'm so happy I came. I have a question for Dawn. Dawn, I've always, as a writer myself, I always think that once I get the structure of a book, I've got the book. And it seems to me, and this may be wrong, but what you got from the diaries of this woman, which was, it sounds like, endless complaint about her life, informative complaint, but complaint nonetheless. But I feel like as a writer, what you got from her is a structure for your book that had not occurred to you before. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, Monica, that's so interesting to say that, because it was a structure, but it was a structure that started out like at the granular level of the language. Like I started seeing holes and not knowing what they were, so I would put a word in, and then I started paying attention to sentence syntax. So the sentence structure became its own sort of driving force. And then I started to think about kind of the structure of her days, like the cycles of her complaints. And all of that is true. And it fell into, the structure of the week and the month. These sort of day by day tediums became almost the framework of the collection, but it was working backwards into the larger structure from the individual words or missing words that was so strange and surprising for me.
Thank you. That makes perfect sense.
Thanks, Monica, for that question. As other people might be thinking about possible questions, I had one that I wanted to throw out to all three of you. I wondered if there was if there was a moment where when you were younger, where you it was kind of like a lightning rod moment where you wanted to be a writer, like if there was something that just kind of maybe there wasn't, but I wondered if there was, if you would be willing to say a little bit about it.
I wanted to be a teacher. Used to play school and I was a teacher.
Yeah. Teachers and writers, definitely very close. Yes.
Well,
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
thank you. Well, I wanted to be an astronaut as a child of the 60s, but there was that whole, height requirement and, being male. So that kind of fell by the wayside. I guess as a historian, I think back with 2020 hindsight, and probably what inspired me was Nancy Drew. I remember as clear as a bell where those books were housed in the Peacedale, Rhode Island Public Library. And I remember the day I finished the last one of the collection, and the librarian said, well, now it's time for you to go upstairs, which were the more grown-up adult books. And that made me feel so proud. But ever since reading Nancy Drew, just the idea of figuring out a story stuck with me. And then as education and academia became my career, my goal is to tell a good story and to teach my students how to uncover either their own stories or the history and stories of the things that matter to them. So I think we can thank Carolyn Keene and Nancy Drew with her groovy sports car and her classy pumps for what I'm doing today.
And such a close tie to the mystery that you told us about. You were unraveling that mystery. Yeah, thanks, Dawn.
I learned how to read music and read words at the same time when I was 6 years old, because I played the violin, and so I was doing these two things at once, and to me that they overlapped very much. I didn't really become aware that I wanted to be a poet until I was almost 30, but I was still living in the world of sound and language, but not putting two and two together. But I think it was very formative. It's almost like learning a foreign language really young, having that kind of imprint of music really young. So that's what I sort of feel.
Music and poetry so closely kind of overlap, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
Can I show the book, Jeff? I have
Yes,
it right
please.
here. This is the one that we just published, and I didn't even mention. Still, They Remember Me. Tales Told by New Alliance to Frank Speck in 1918, republished, and Connor Quinn has the Penobscot, our contemporary writing system, in there.
Yes, thank you, Carol, for showing that. That book is so beautifully printed, but also just so engaging to look through. Like there are so many things to look at. Yeah, thank you. Well, okay. I don't know if it seems like we may not have any more questions, but thank you all so much for, is there a link? Oh, yes. Is there a link to that one? Yes. I put it earlier. Let me put it again. That book is definitely worth linking to again. Yes. Here it is. It's from UMass. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers tonight for taking such time to talk to us, and everybody who came tonight. It's really nice to see everybody for this event. So I think that's about it. Thank you all very much.
Minach Knamio.